In the rigged world of professional wrestling, being talented doesn't always mean you get to be champion. While mediocre wrestlers with the right connections held championship gold for years, some of the greatest performers who ever stepped foot in the ring got screwed out of their rightful place at the top. Ricky Steamboat, the master technician who made every match look like poetry in motion. Mr. Perfect, the athlete who truly lived up to his name with flawless matches. Scott Hall, the cool, charismatic bad guy. These men had everything it takes to be world champions except the one thing that mattered most: the right timing, the right politics, or the right connections. Today, we examine the tragic tales of wrestling's most criminally underutilized talents. The superstars who conquered hearts and minds but never conquered the one prize that would have cemented their legacy forever. First up, Ricky Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat was one of wrestling's most technically gifted athletes, whose picture-perfect drop kicks and flawless execution made him the standard by which all wrestlers were measured. He delivered legendary matches that drew millions, while making promoters rich beyond their wildest dreams. But when Steamboat refused controversial storylines and dared to put his family before the business, WWE blacklisted him and made sure he would never reach the top. What happened to Ricky reveals the cutthroat machine that destroys anyone who won't sell their soul to corporate greed. But his story starts long before these corporate battles, with a man who never even planned to become a wrestler. Richard Henry Blood was born in West Point, New York on February 20th, 1953, into a military family that would take him around the world. His father's service in the U.S. military meant constant movement from base to base, exposing Richard to different cultures and ways of life that most future wrestlers never experienced. He died firefighting before fate intervened, having no childhood dreams of becoming a professional wrestler, while other future stars were already fantasizing about championship gold. Richard's athletic talents emerged in high school, where he became a Florida state champion in amateur wrestling. This wasn't part of some grand plan to become a wrestling superstar. It was just a kid who happened to be naturally gifted at sports. His amateur wrestling success gave him a foundation that would later prove invaluable, teaching him real wrestling techniques and building the kind of athletic ability that would set him apart from his peers. The wrestling business found Richard through his girlfriend's connection to the industry. She knew someone who knew someone, and before long, Richard was hearing about opportunities in professional wrestling. This accidental entry into the business was completely different from wrestlers who grew up watching matches and dreaming of fame. Richard approached wrestling as an outsider, without the emotional baggage or unrealistic expectations that often came with childhood dreams of wrestling stardom. When Richard decided to pursue professional wrestling, he headed to Minnesota to train under Vern Gagne. Gagne's training camp was legendary for its brutality. It wasn't just about learning wrestling moves. It was about breaking down hopefuls and rebuilding them from scratch. Most people who showed up at Gagne's camp never made it through the training. The physical demands were extreme, the mental pressure was constant, and Gagne had no patience for anyone who wasn't completely committed. Richard's experience at the training camp was a shock to his system. He lost 40 pounds during the training process, showing just how intense the program was. His body was pushed to its absolute limits as he learned the fundamentals of professional wrestling. The weight loss wasn't just from exercise, it was from the stress, the physical punishment, and the complete transformation required to become a professional wrestler. Many trainees couldn't handle the pressure and quit, but Richard's military background and natural toughness helped him survive. The diverse background Richard brought to wrestling gave him a unique perspective that other wrestlers lacked. He had seen the world, experienced different cultures, and approached wrestling as a business rather than a childhood fantasy. This outsider's view would later become both his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. His worldly perspective helped him develop a more sophisticated approach to wrestling, but it also put him at odds with the traditional wrestling mentality that valued loyalty and compliance over independent thinking. Richard's late start in wrestling meant he approached the business differently than wrestlers who had been dreaming of it their whole lives. He wasn't willing to sacrifice everything for wrestling success because he had other life experiences to draw from. This balanced perspective would later cause problems with promoters who expected total devotion to the wrestling business. His military family background taught him about discipline and respect, but it also gave him a strong sense of personal values that wouldn't bend easily to wrestling's demands. The fact that Richard stumbled into wrestling almost by accident created a wrestler who was technically excellent but politically naive. His amateur wrestling background gave him legitimate athletic credentials that most wrestlers couldn't match. His diverse upbringing made him more well-rounded as a person than many of his peers. However, his lack of childhood wrestling dreams meant he never fully understood the unwritten rules of wrestling politics. Richard Henry Blood's unconventional entry into wrestling created both his greatest strengths and his biggest weaknesses in dealing with promoters. His journey from military brat to wrestling prodigy strategy was just beginning, and the real education was about to start when he entered the territorial system. What happened once he headed to Florida's wrestling scene would teach him lessons that Vernagong's brutal training camp never could. Florida's wrestling scene introduced Richard to a world where identity was just another marketing tool. Eddie Graham, the powerful promoter running championship wrestling from Florida, looked at this young athlete and saw potential. He also saw an opportunity to create a story that would sell tickets. Graham decided that Richard would become the nephew of Sammy Steamboat, a wrestler who had enjoyed success in Florida and was still remembered by older fans. This fabricated family connection was designed to give the new wrestler instant credibility and name recognition with fans who might remember Sammy from years before. The transformation from Rick Blood to Ricky Steamboat happened without any input from the man himself. Promoters controlled every aspect of a wrestler's identity in the territorial system, and Richard had no say in becoming Steamboat. Graham saw value in an Asian-flavored persona in Florida's market, capitalizing on the martial arts movie craze that was sweeping through popular culture. This was his first lesson in how wrestling promoters operated. Your real identity didn't matter as much as what they could sell to the audience. The territorial system was a harsh environment that chewed up wrestlers and spit them out. Wrestlers traveled constantly, driving hundreds of miles between small towns for shows that might draw 50 people or 500. The pay was low and unpredictable. Promoters promised certain amounts, but often paid less when ticket sales were disappointing. Wrestlers had to cover their own travel expenses, hotel rooms, and meals while making very little money. The schedule was brutal. Wrestlers might work every night of the week, sometimes twice on weekends, with no guaranteed days off. In Florida and Georgia, Steamboat began developing the smooth technical style that would become his trademark. Unlike many wrestlers who relied on brawling or power moves, Steamboat focused on crisp technical wrestling combined with impressive athletic ability. He studied martial arts films and incorporated moves that looked spectacular but were relatively safe to perform. His background in legitimate amateur wrestling gave him a foundation that many professional wrestlers lacked. He could execute complex holds and transitions that looked effortless but required years of practice to master. The Kung Fu movie craze of the 1970s gave Steamboat an opportunity to stand out from typical wrestlers. Bruce Lee films and other martial arts movies were incredibly popular, and Steamboat incorporated elements from these films into his wrestling style. He developed a martial arts-inspired moveset that included high-flying moves, precise strikes, and dramatic poses that looked like they came straight from a kung fu film. His signature dragon suplex and flying crossbody became crowd favorites because they looked both dangerous and beautiful when executed properly. Steamboat's partnership with Jay Youngblood represented something rare in professional wrestling, a genuine friendship. Most wrestling relationships were manufactured for business purposes, but Steamboat and Youngblood developed a real bond that extended beyond the ring. They traveled together, supported each other through the challenges of the wrestling business, and became inseparable behind the scenes. Their authentic friendship translated into incredible chemistry as a tag team, and fans could sense that their connection was real. This authenticity made them hugely popular with audiences who were tired of obviously fake relationships between wrestlers. Early signs of Steamboat's principled nature began clashing with promoter expectations and business demands. Unlike many wrestlers who would do anything promoters asked, Steamboat had personal boundaries that he wasn't willing to cross. He refused to participate in storylines that went against his values or portrayed him in ways that made him uncomfortable. This principled stance impressed other wrestlers but frustrated promoters who expected complete compliance. His unwillingness to compromise his values for business success marked him as different from other wrestlers who would agree to any storyline if it meant more money or better positioning. Steamboat's territorial success came at the cost of learning to navigate wrestling politics, a skill he never fully mastered. He focused on improving his in-ring performance and connecting with audiences, but he never learned how to play the backstage games that were essential for long-term success. While other wrestlers were building relationships with bookers and promoters, Steamboat was perfecting his craft. His technical excellence and fan popularity should have been enough, but wrestling success required political skills that he didn't possess. His move to Jim Crockett Promotions would bring bigger opportunities and bigger challenges, where his abilities would be tested by someone who immediately recognized his potential. Ric Flair saw Steamboat's potential immediately, but their legendary rivalry almost ended Steamboat's career before it truly began. When Steamboat arrived at Jim Crockett Promotions in 1977, he walked into a completely different world than the smaller territorial promotions he was used to. JCP was big business, with television deals, major arenas, and established stars who had been working together for years. This wasn't just about having good matches anymore. It was about fitting into a complex system where personal relationships and backstage maneuvering mattered as much as what happened in the ring. Ric Flair was already the top star when Steamboat showed up, and he immediately recognized something special in the newcomer. Flair said, "Here's a guy that's handsome with a great body, a nice guy, and Ricky Steamboat could wrestle from day one." This endorsement from the company's biggest star opened doors for Steamboat that might have taken years to open otherwise. Flair's support meant better matches, more television time, and opportunities to work with other top wrestlers. The brutal reality of their early matches showed just how dangerous wrestling could be when wrestlers pushed the limits. Flair and Steamboat developed a chemistry that was electric, but it came at a physical cost. In one particularly intense match, Flair rubbed Steamboat's face against the concrete floor outside the ring, in a spot that could have caused permanent damage. The concrete was rough and unforgiving, and the friction could have torn skin off Steamboat's face or caused serious injuries to his eyes. This wasn't just about making the match look realistic. It was about two wrestlers who trusted each other enough to do incredibly dangerous things to create unforgettable moments. The contrasting personalities between Flair and Steamboat made their rivalry even more compelling for audiences. Flair lived the extravagant lifestyle that matched his nature boy character: expensive suits, luxury cars, and a lifestyle that screamed excess. He partied hard, spent money freely, and made sure everyone knew he was living the high life. Steamboat was the complete opposite. He focused on his family, lived modestly, and approached wrestling as a job rather than a lifestyle. He went home to his wife and kids instead of hitting the bars with other wrestlers. This difference wasn't just about their characters, it was about who they really were as people. Their chemistry in the ring generated massive revenue for Jim Crockett Promotions, but it also created unrealistic expectations for Steamboat's character. Fans loved watching the humble, hard-working Steamboat battle the arrogant, wealthy Flair. The matches drew huge crowds and sold tons of tickets, proving that their rivalry was money in the bank for the promotion. However, this success trapped Steamboat in a specific role. Promoters expected him to always be the good guy, the family man, the wrestler who did things the right way. Any attempt to change his character or try something different was met with resistance because the Flair feud had established what fans expected from Steamboat. Steamboat's NWA Television Championship win in North Carolina established him as a legitimate main event talent in the eyes of fans and other wrestlers. The television championship was an important title in JCP because it was defended regularly on television, giving the champion consistent exposure and credibility. Steamboat's reign proved he could carry a championship and be a featured performer week after week. His matches were consistently good, and he drew positive reactions from crowds throughout the territory. The success in the Carolinas was preparing Steamboat for bigger stages, but it was also setting him up for political challenges that would make JCP look simple. His reputation as a great wrestler was growing, and bigger promotions were starting to notice. The Flair rivalry taught Steamboat that great matches weren't enough. You also had to play the backstage game. However, his focus on wrestling excellence rather than backstage politics meant he wasn't developing the skills he would need to navigate more complex corporate environments. His next opportunity would test every lesson he thought he'd learned about the wrestling business. Steamboat's WWF debut was everything he dreamed of, but Vince McMahon's corporate machine was about to teach him a harsh lesson about loyalty. When Steamboat arrived in the WWF in 1986, he walked into a completely different world than the territorial promotions he was used to. This wasn't just a bigger wrestling company. It was a corporate entertainment machine that controlled every aspect of its performers' lives. The WWF had strict rules about character consistency and demanded absolute availability from wrestlers. Everything was designed to protect the company's image and maximize profits. The timing of Steamboat's arrival couldn't have been better for creating his dragon character. Martial arts movies were huge in the 1980s, and the WWF was always looking for ways to capitalize on popular trends. They saw Steamboat's martial arts-inspired moveset and immediately recognized the marketing potential. The company created elaborate entrance music, colorful costumes, and promotional materials that played up the dragon persona. Steamboat's natural athletic ability and smooth wrestling style fit perfectly with what audiences expected from a martial arts-inspired character. The pressure of the WWF's corporate structure was unlike anything Steamboat had experienced in his career. The company demanded absolute loyalty from its wrestlers. This meant being available for television tapings, house shows, and promotional appearances whenever the company needed you. Wrestlers were expected to stay in character at all times, even when they weren't performing. The WWF made it clear that the company's needs came before any personal considerations. Steamboat's feud with Jake Roberts showed just how dangerous the WWF's approach to wrestling could be. The matches between Steamboat and Roberts were brutal affairs that often resulted in legitimate injuries. Roberts was known for his psychological warfare and willingness to push boundaries, but the WWF encouraged this kind of intensity because it made for compelling television. Steamboat suffered real injuries from dangerous spots that were designed to look spectacular rather than be safe. The company's attitude was that injuries were part of the business, and wrestlers were expected to work through pain to maintain their spot on the roster. The WrestleMania 3 match against Randy Savage was the perfect example of how the WWF manufactured classic matches. Steamboat and Savage planned their match move for move, practicing dozens of different spots to create maximum drama and excitement. The company's production team worked with both wrestlers to design a match that would tell a compelling story and showcase both performers' abilities. The match went exactly as planned, with Steamboat winning the Intercontinental Championship in what many consider one of the greatest matches in wrestling history. However, this success came with a price that Steamboat didn't fully understand at the time. Winning the Intercontinental Championship seemed like validation of everything Steamboat had worked for in his career. The title was often called the Workers' Championship because it was typically given to wrestlers who were respected for their in-ring ability. Steamboat's reign proved that he belonged at the top level of the wrestling business. However, becoming champion also put him under more corporate scrutiny than ever before. The WWF expected their champions to be available for more promotional work, more television appearances, and more demanding travel schedules. The title came with responsibilities that extended far beyond what happened in the ring. The mounting pressure between Steamboat's wrestling success and his personal values created a conflict that was becoming impossible to ignore. His family commitments were important to him, but the WWF's schedule made it difficult to spend time at home. The company expected wrestlers to prioritize the business above everything else, including their families. Steamboat watched other wrestlers sacrifice their personal relationships for wrestling success, and he wasn't sure he wanted to make the same choice. His values told him that family should come first, but the wrestling business demanded total commitment. Steamboat's WWF success was built on a foundation that required sacrificing everything else, a price he wasn't willing to pay. The company's demands were relentless, and there was no room for compromise when it came to loyalty and availability. Other wrestlers had learned to accept this reality, but Steamboat's background and values made it impossible for him to completely surrender his personal life to the wrestling business. The disciplined corporate environment that had made him a champion was about to test his priorities in ways he never expected. When Steamboat's son was born in March 1987, he made a request that seemed reasonable, but to Vince McMahon, it was an act of betrayal that would destroy his career. Right after his WrestleMania 3 triumph, Steamboat's wife Bonnie was pregnant with their first child, Richard Jr. For most people, this would be a joyous time when family takes priority over everything else. Steamboat approached McMahon with what he thought was a simple request. He wanted time off to be with his wife for the birth of their son. This wasn't asking for months away from wrestling or demanding special treatment. He just wanted to be there for one of the most important moments in his life as a husband and father. McMahon's reaction was swift and brutal. On June 13, 1987, Steamboat lost the Intercontinental Championship to Honky Tonk Man as punishment for prioritizing family over business. The decision shocked Steamboat and everyone else in the company. Here was a wrestler who had just delivered one of the greatest matches in WrestleMania history, a performer who was over with the crowd and drawing money for the company. Yet McMahon saw his request for family time as a direct challenge to the WWF's authority and an unacceptable disruption to business operations. The decision to give the title to Honky Tonk Man was a deliberate message to the entire roster about loyalty expectations. McMahon could have chosen any wrestler to take the championship from Steamboat, but he specifically selected Honky Tonk Man, a performer who was nowhere near Steamboat's level of talent or fan popularity. This wasn't about finding the best wrestler for the championship. It was about sending a clear signal that loyalty to the company mattered more than talent, fan support, or drawing power. Every wrestler in the locker room understood what this meant. Cross McMahon's corporate demands, and your career would suffer regardless of your abilities. His reputation as the consummate babyface became a creative prison that limited his options in an evolving wrestling landscape. Wrestling was changing in the late 1980s, with more complex characters and storylines becoming popular. Steamboat was locked into the role of the good guy who always did the right thing, but this character type was becoming less relevant in a business that was moving toward more edgy and controversial content. His wholesome family man image, which had been an asset, now made him seem outdated compared to wrestlers who were willing to push boundaries and take creative risks. The systematic burial of Steamboat's character began almost immediately after his request for family time. His main event matches became less frequent, replaced by mid-card feuds that didn't showcase his abilities or draw significant fan interest. The storylines he was given became weaker and less compelling, making it harder for him to connect with audiences. His television time was reduced, limiting his exposure and making it difficult to maintain his fan base. These changes weren't accidental. They were a deliberate strategy to diminish his importance within the company. Other wrestlers watched watched what happened to Steamboat and learned that crossing McMahon had severe consequences. The locker room saw how quickly a top performer could be demoted for putting personal considerations ahead of company demands. This created a culture of fear, where wrestlers were afraid to ask for time off, request changes to their characters, or challenge creative decisions. The message was clear: your value to the company was conditional on your willingness to sacrifice everything else for wrestling success. Steamboat's attempts to return to his previous position after his son's birth were met with continued resistance from management. When he came back at the Survivor Series in November 1987, he was included in the WrestleMania 4 tournament for the vacant WWF Championship, but his push was significantly curtailed. The decisive moment came when he lost to Greg Valentine in the first round of the tournament, effectively ending any hope of returning to main event status. McMahon's lingering resentment over Steamboat's sabbatical affected every decision about his character and storylines. His frustrations with his new position and the WWF's creative direction eventually led him to seek opportunities elsewhere. Steamboat was disgruntled with his role on the card and the lack of meaningful feuds being offered to him. He realized that his relationship with McMahon had been permanently damaged by his request for family time, and there was no path back to his previous status within the company. His departure from the WWF in 1988 seemed like the end of his main event career, but another opportunity was waiting that would prove wrestling success was still possible for someone who refused to compromise his values. On January 21, 1989, Steamboat signed with WCW as their first major acquisition from the WWF, making a statement that they were serious about competing with Vince McMahon's empire. This wasn't just about getting another wrestler on the roster. WCW wanted established stars who could bring credibility to their company and attract fans who might not have been watching WCW programming. Steamboat's arrival signaled a shift in how WCW approached talent acquisition and showed they were willing to invest in proven performers. WCW initially treated Steamboat as a valued star, giving him the world title and main event matches that showcased his abilities. The company understood what they had in Steamboat and didn't waste time putting him in meaningless feuds or mid-card storylines. They gave him an immediate championship opportunity against Ric Flair, the company's biggest star and most reliable performer. This wasn't a gradual build-up or a test to see if Steamboat could handle the pressure. WCW was confident enough in his abilities to put him directly into their main event scene. The legendary trilogy of matches with Flair elevated both wrestlers and the company to new heights. Their February 20th, 1989 match at Chi-Town Rumble was a wrestling showcase that demonstrated what professional wrestling could be when two masters of the craft worked together. The match told a complete story in the ring, with both men pushing each other to their limits and creating moments that fans still talk about today. Steamboat's victory was a great moment in WCW history and pro wrestling as a whole, proving that he belonged in the main event picture. The second match of their trilogy was a 2 out of 3 falls match at Clash of the Champions 6 on April 2nd in New Orleans. Many consider this the best of the 3 matches because of the incredible conditioning both men displayed and the dramatic finish that added to the feud. Both wrestlers scored pinfalls during the match, taking the audience on an emotional journey that showcased why they were considered the best wrestlers of that era. The match went down to the wire, with both men giving everything they had to win. These matches represented the peak of wrestling as sport before the shift to sports entertainment. Jim Cornette stated that the Flair vs. Steamboat trilogy was the peak of an entertaining sport versus sports entertainment. Their matches focused on athletic competition and storytelling through wrestling moves rather than elaborate storylines or entertainment segments. This was pure wrestling at its finest, with both men relying on their technical skills and ring psychology to create compelling television. Steamboat's NWA title reign from February to May 1989 was impactful because he brought a new style of athletic wrestling to the championship. His matches with Flair were highly entertaining, and even though he held the title for just 3 months, he had some of the best NWA title matches in the history of the belt. This reign solidified his status as a top-tier performer and proved that WCW valued his contributions more than the WWF ever did. The company gave him the platform to showcase his abilities at the highest level. The gradual changes in WCW's corporate culture became apparent as new management took over and priorities shifted. After dropping the title back to Flair, Steamboat found himself without a clear direction in the company. No subsequent storyline matched the drama of his rivalry with Flair, highlighting the challenges Steamboat faced in navigating wrestling politics. The company seemed unsure of how to use him effectively outside of his legendary feud. Steamboat's departure from WCW later in 1989 was due to a contract dispute that the company couldn't resolve. The NWA and WCW style of wrestling really helped Ricky Steamboat, but they just couldn't come to terms on a new contract. This situation showed the business side of wrestling and how contract negotiations could end promising runs. His back injury in 1994 during a match with Steve Austin made him vulnerable to corporate politics once again. The injury occurred during a rematch at Clash of the Champions 20 when Steamboat took a bad bump from the top turnbuckle. This injury forced him to relinquish the United States Championship and put him out of action. Being injured in professional wrestling meant you were no longer generating revenue for the company, making you expendable regardless of your past contributions. The shocking FedEx firing while Steamboat was still recovering from his back injury showed how disposable even legends were to wrestling corporations. Eric Bischoff fired him via a FedEx package, which was a cost-cutting measure that reflected the changing landscape of wrestling. This incident exposed the wrestling industry's true nature and showed how even respected veterans could be discarded when they were no longer useful to the company's bottom line. The betrayal cut deeper than any corporate punishment he had faced before, proving that talent and legacy meant nothing when profits were at stake. Wrestling history would remember Steamboat differently if he had been willing to compromise his principles for corporate success. When you look at Steamboat's career, it becomes clear that his trajectory was shaped more by backstage politics than his incredible in-ring performance. He was universally respected by his peers as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time, yet his career never reached the heights that his talent deserved. The reason wasn't his ability to wrestle or connect with fans. It was his unwillingness to compromise his personal values for corporate success. Compare Steamboat's treatment to wrestlers who played the political game better, despite having less talent or drawing power. While Steamboat was getting buried for requesting family time, other wrestlers who knew how to navigate backstage politics were getting pushed to the moon. Take Honky Tonk Man, who held the Intercontinental Championship for over a year, despite being nowhere near Steamboat's level of in-ring ability. These wrestlers might not have had Steamboat's technical skills or natural charisma, but they understood what promoters wanted to hear. They said yes to every creative direction, never questioned storylines, and made themselves completely available to the company's demands. This compliance was rewarded with better positions on the card, more television time, and opportunities that Steamboat never got. Steamboat's principled stands were systematically punished by promoters who valued compliance over ability. He didn't want to compromise his character or values, even if it would have helped his career. Most wrestlers would have jumped at the chance to try different characters if it meant more money and better storylines. But Steamboat's integrity wouldn't allow him to portray something that made him uncomfortable, even if it would have advanced his position in the company. His later WWE returns showed how past conflicts limited his opportunities even as a legend. When Steamboat came back to WWE, for special appearances and his Hall of Fame induction, he was treated respectfully but never given the spotlight that his contributions deserved. The company remembered his past conflicts with McMahon and made sure to keep his role limited. Other wrestlers from his era who had maintained better relationships with management got more prominent roles and better treatment during their return appearances. Steamboat's past conflicts followed him even decades later. The reputation for being difficult followed Steamboat throughout his career, despite being universally respected by peers. This perception came from his unwillingness to compromise his values and his tendency to speak up when he felt wrestlers were being mistreated. In the wrestling business, standing up for principles was often seen as being difficult to work with. Promoters wanted wrestlers who would agree to anything without question. Steamboat's willingness to push back on creative decisions or contract terms earned him a reputation that hurt his career opportunities. The long-term impact on Steamboat's legacy is evident in how many casual fans might recognize names like Hulk Hogan or The Ultimate Warrior before mentioning Steamboat when discussing the greatest wrestlers of the 1980s. Many of these wrestlers couldn't match Steamboat's in-ring ability, but they understood how to work within the system. They knew how to stay in management's good graces and position themselves for success. Steamboat's focus on wrestling excellence rather than political maneuvering meant he never got the recognition he deserved from mainstream audiences. Steamboat's story represents a broader pattern in wrestling's treatment of principled performers. The wrestling industry has always rewarded compliance and adaptability more than talent and integrity. Wrestlers who were willing to sacrifice their personal values for corporate success often found themselves in better positions than those who maintained their principles. This pattern continues today, where wrestlers who are seen as good for business get opportunities regardless of their talent level, while more skilled wrestlers who don't fit the corporate mold get overlooked. Jim Cornette observed that the Flair vs. Steamboat trilogy represented the peak of an entertaining sport versus sports entertainment. This comment highlights how Steamboat's commitment to in-ring excellence was becoming outdated in an industry that increasingly valued spectacle over athletic competition. His approach to wrestling, while celebrated by purists, was less commercially viable as the business evolved toward entertainment rather than sport. Modern wrestlers like CM Punk have acknowledged Steamboat's influence on their careers, emphasizing his commitment to in-ring excellence and his ability to connect with audiences. This influence proves that Steamboat's legacy extends beyond championships or main event positions. His dedication to his craft continues to resonate with wrestlers who followed in his footsteps, showing that some victories can't be measured in titles or corporate approval. Next up, Scott Hall. Scott Hall was one of wrestling's most charismatic performers, revolutionizing the business when he formed the NWO. He went from being a struggling mid-carder to becoming the bad guy Razor Ramon, a cultural icon who carried the Intercontinental Championship with style and swagger. In 2022, at 63 years old, he passed away after being taken off life support. Scott Hall was no doubt one of the greatest, but one question remains unanswered. Why WWE never gave him a world title run? In 1958, Scott Oliver Hall was born in St. Mary's County, Maryland, beginning a nomadic childhood that few could imagine. As the son of a military man constantly receiving new orders, young Scott found himself uprooted and replanted in unfamiliar soil nearly every year until he was 15. Though wrestling captivated his imagination from an early age, the path to the squared circle wasn't immediately clear. After graduation, Scott drifted through life like a ship without anchor, taking whatever work would pay the bills. His imposing frame and natural intimidation factor made him perfect for security work, and he found steady employment guarding the doors of various bars and nightclubs, keeping watch over the rowdy nightlife scene. But fate has a way of violently redirecting our paths when we least expect it. In 1983, while working security at an Orlando nightclub, Hall's life changed forever during one fateful shift. What began as routine crowd control escalated into a life-or-death struggle that ended with Hall firing his weapon in self-defense. The patron died from his wounds. Though initially charged with second-degree murder, the case was eventually dismissed when investigators confirmed Hall had acted to protect himself. But legal exoneration couldn't erase the psychological damage. This traumatic incident would cast a long shadow across Hall's future. His closest confidant, Kevin Nash, would later point to this moment as the catalyst for the demons that would eventually hunt Hall throughout his career, the addiction issues that nearly consumed him. How do you move forward when you've taken a life, even justifiably? It's a question Hall would spend decades trying to answer. Seeking escape and reinvention, Hall made the pivotal decision to pursue professional wrestling in 1984. Championship Wrestling from Florida recognized the untapped potential in this physically imposing newcomer with natural charisma. Immediately, they thrust him into the spotlight with a high-profile feud against the legendary Dusty Rhodes, baptism by fire for any wrestling rookie. What followed was a wrestling education unlike any other, as Hall traversed the territory system alongside tag team partner Dan Spivey, absorbing different styles and approaches, building the foundation for what would become one of wrestling's most influential careers. In 1985, after bouncing between promotions like a pinball, including stops at Jim Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas and Midwest Wrestling Association in Missouri, Hall landed in what many consider wrestling's prestigious finishing school, Vern Gaines' American Wrestling Association. This wasn't just another territory. The AWA stood as one of wrestling's powerhouse organizations, a breeding ground for superstars where legends were forged. Here, Hall underwent his first major character transformation. Who was this mustachioed powerhouse commanding attention? None other than Magnum Scott Hall, a fan favorite whose uncanny resemblance to television heartthrob Tom Selleck became his calling card. Behind the scenes, something remarkable was happening. Vern Gaines, with his legendary eye for talent, saw something special in Hall that few others had recognized. Whispers circulated throughout the locker room that Gagne believed he'd discovered his next Hulk Hogan, the superstar who'd slipped through his fingers years earlier. How serious was Gagne about this vision? Serious enough to personally instruct Hall to incorporate Hogan-esque moves and mannerisms into his performances, hoping lightning might strike twice. The strategy initially paid dividends. Hall's career trajectory soared as he formed a formidable partnership with the technically brilliant Curt Hennig, creating magic in the ring night after night. When that alliance eventually dissolved, Hall didn't miss a beat, transitioning seamlessly into singles competition where he quickly ascended the ranks. Before long, this former drifter found himself standing across the ring from legendary champions like the fearsome Stan Hansen and the technically superior Rick Martel, challenging for wrestling's most coveted prize, the AWA World Championship. What made Hall different from other physically imposing wrestlers wasn't just his look or his size. It was an intangible quality that made fans believe in him, a natural charisma that couldn't be taught. Though championship gold remained just beyond his grasp during this period, something more valuable was happening. Scott Hall was becoming a complete performer, developing the tools that would eventually make him one of wrestling's most influential figures. By 1989, Scott Hall's wrestling instincts weren't limited to the ring. His business acumen had sharpened too. Despite his growing popularity in the AWA, Hall recognized the warning signs: dwindling crowds, bounced paychecks, and an organization struggling to stay relevant in a rapidly changing industry. The once mighty AWA was taking on water fast. Would you stay aboard a sinking vessel when your career was at stake? What followed was a professional wrestler's version of a world tour, as Hall transformed himself into a wrestling nomad, testing waters across the globe. His journey began with a 6-month stint at World Championship Wrestling, where he first crossed paths with the Atlanta-based promotion that would later define his legacy. But the odyssey was just beginning. Like a master craftsman seeking new techniques, Hall expanded his wrestling education overseas. He battled in the technically demanding rings of New Japan Pro Wrestling, where Western showmanship met Eastern fighting spirit. Then it was off to Germany's Catch Wrestling Association, where the hard-hitting European style added new weapons to his arsenal. The sun-soaked arenas of Puerto Rico's World Wrestling Council saw him perform before passionate Caribbean crowds. He even participated in a WWE tryout that, puzzlingly, didn't immediately lead to a contract. What were they missing that they'd later regret? By 1991, Hall's compass pointed him back to WCW, where his evolution continued with the birth of the Diamond Stud, a character dripping with arrogance and machismo that channeled the cocky essence of Rick Rude. With the flamboyant Diamond Dallas Page as his manager and mouthpiece, this new incarnation of Hall cut through WCW's mid-card talent like Tommy Rich and Tom Zenk with devastating efficiency. It was during this return to WCW that wrestling history quietly began writing its most influential chapter. Hall formed a brief but significant partnership with another imposing figure using the moniker Vinny Vegas, none other than Kevin Nash. Though neither man could have known it then, this temporary alliance was merely the prelude to a friendship that would eventually reshape the wrestling industry. Despite finding his groove in WCW, when opportunity knocked in the form of a WWE contract in May 1992, Hall didn't hesitate. Sometimes success requires perfect timing, and Hall sensed that his moment had arrived. With his bags packed and his sights set on the biggest wrestling company in the world, Scott Hall prepared to answer the most important call of his career, one that would transform him from a wrestling journeyman into a household name. In May 1992, Scott Hall stepped onto WWE's grand stage as Razor Ramon, a character that would forever change wrestling history. But here's what makes it fascinating. This wasn't just another gimmick handed down from creative. The slick-talking, gold chain-wearing bad guy sprang directly from Hall's own imagination, after immersing himself in Al Pacino's iconic portrayal of Tony Montana in Scarface. How many wrestlers create their own defining personas? Say hello to the bad guy. With those words, delivered in his perfect Pacino-inspired Cuban accent, Hall instantly captivated audiences. While other newcomers struggled to find their footing, Razor Ramon exploded onto the scene with a fully realized character. His methodical dismantling of WWE's undercard talent wasn't just about winning matches. It was calculated character building that made him look absolutely lethal. Each toothpick flicked at fallen opponents told a story of arrogance and superiority that audiences couldn't ignore. Something unexpected started happening during those early months. Despite being positioned as a villain, fans couldn't help but admire him. What makes certain bad guys so irresistible? Razor's swagger, confidence, and undeniable coolness made him one of wrestling's earliest examples of a cool heel. Someone fans secretly cheered despite their villainous actions. His perfectly slicked back hair, dazzling gold chains, and signature catchphrases created an aura that transcended traditional wrestling roles. WWE recognized they had something special and wasted no time throwing their new acquisition into the deep end. On September 14, 1992, primetime wrestling viewers witnessed Razor Ramon insert himself into wrestling royalty when he cost the beloved Macho Man Randy Savage a crucial match against the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Interfering against a legend like Savage wasn't just any debut feud. It was an immediate signal that management viewed Hall as main event material. This high-profile rivalry culminated at that year's Survivor Series, where the wrestling world witnessed something extraordinary: a tag team collision featuring Razor and Flair battling against Savage and Mr. Perfect. Can you imagine a better spotlight for a newcomer? Sharing the ring with three certified legends, Hall didn't just keep pace, he belonged there. The match accomplished exactly what it needed to, establishing Razor Ramon as more than just another new face. He was a superstar destined for greatness. Behind that confident smirk and those intimidating eyes, Scott Hall was proving what insiders had long suspected. He possessed one of wrestling's most brilliant creative minds. His innate understanding of character development, psychology, and presentation was creating something that would resonate with fans for decades to come. Little did anyone know, Razor Ramon was just the beginning of Scott Hall's revolutionary impact on professional wrestling. Following his impressive showing against Macho Man, Vince McMahon fast-tracked Razor Ramon straight into WWE's championship picture. The 1993 Royal Rumble saw the bad guy challenge none other than technical mastermind Bret Hitman Hart for the coveted WWE Championship. Although Hall didn't capture the gold that night, something more valuable occurred. The match convinced skeptics that this newcomer belonged in main events. By summer 1993, fan reaction had become impossible to ignore. WWE executives recognized a golden opportunity when a seemingly routine match against an unknown jobber named the 1-2-3 Kid created magic. Remember that shocking moment when the undersized underdog somehow pinned the mighty Razor Ramon on Monday Night Raw? The upset victory didn't just launch Sean Waltman's career, it provided the perfect storyline catalyst for Hall's character evolution. Instead of responding with anger, Razor showed unexpected sportsmanship. His growing respect for the young upstart who had embarrassed him transformed naturally into a full babyface turn. Fans who had been secretly cheering could now openly embrace the bad guy as one of their favorites. The former rivals even formed an unlikely partnership, teaming together against common enemies. Behind the curtain, something equally significant was developing. The on-screen partnership between Hall and Waltman mirrored a growing real-life friendship. They soon found themselves gravitating toward like-minded performers: Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, and an up-and-coming Triple H. Together, they formed what wrestling insiders would come to know as the Clique. This wasn't just another backstage friendship. The Clique quietly accumulated unprecedented influence within WWE's power structure. Their collective star power, creative input, and strategic positioning gave them the kind of backstage pull that wrestling had rarely seen before. At times, industry veterans wondered who truly controlled WWE's direction. Was it Vince McMahon or this tight-knit group of performers who protected each other's interests? How much control should wrestlers have over their own storylines? As Razor Ramon's popularity soared on screen, Scott Hall's backstage influence grew proportionally. The cool character fans adored, and the shrewd businessman behind it were both ascending simultaneously, setting the stage for one of wrestling's most consequential careers, and one of its most turbulent personal journeys. The moment Scott Hall truly cemented his place in WWE history was on October 11, 1993, when he defeated former AWA rival Rick Martel to claim his first Intercontinental Championship. It wasn't just another title change, it was validation. After years of wandering the wrestling landscape, Hall had not only found his perfect character but earned championship gold that proved his exceptional talent. But a championship reign rarely comes without controversy. When suspended former champion Shawn Michaels returned, he brought an unexpected claim. Since no one had actually defeated him for the title, wasn't he still the rightful champion? 2 championship belts, 2 elite performers, and one unprecedented solution. How would WWE determine the true champion? The answer revolutionized professional wrestling forever. At WrestleMania 10, Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels climbed into Madison Square Garden and shattered expectations in WWE's first ever pay-per-view ladder match. While modern fans might take ladder matches for granted, imagine being in that arena witnessing something completely new. What happens when 2 of wrestling's most innovative minds are given freedom to create without a blueprint to follow? Magic happened. Their bodies told a story of risk, sacrifice, and championship desire that transcended traditional wrestling. Each painful impact and death-defying leap served a greater narrative purpose. Though Razor emerged victorious as the undisputed Intercontinental Champion, both men walked away as winners. They'd created a template that wrestlers would follow for decades to come. How do you follow up perfection? Razor's momentum carried him into a program with another Clique member, Diesel. Their contrasting styles, Ramon's technical prowess against Nash's raw power, created compelling television throughout the remainder of 1994, further elevating the Intercontinental Championship's prestige. Behind Hall's confident smirk lay a performer at the absolute peak of his powers, respected by peers, adored by fans, and pioneering new forms of in-ring storytelling that would influence generations of wrestlers. The question wasn't if Scott Hall would leave a legacy, but how monumental that legacy would become. Scott Hall's career reached a turning point after his SummerSlam 1995 ladder match with Shawn Michaels. Despite delivering wrestling classics against opponents like Jeff Jarrett, frustration quietly built as Hall watched his friends Nash and Michaels ascend to world championship status while he remained locked in the upper mid-card. The breaking point came when Hall directly approached Vince McMahon, asking what more he could do to reach the next level. McMahon's response was devastating. This was it. In McMahon's vision, Razor Ramon had reached his permanent position in the hierarchy. Meanwhile, WCW's Eric Bischoff was aggressively recruiting WWE talent with Ted Turner's financial backing. Hall wasn't just creatively frustrated. Kevin Nash revealed that financial concerns played a major role too, with both men feeling underpaid despite their drawing power. By early 1996, both Hall and Nash submitted their resignations to WWE. Their final appearance would become wrestling legend, the infamous curtain call incident at Madison Square Garden, where the Clique broke character to embrace publicly, shattering wrestling's sacred kayfabe. With his WWE contract expired and determined to prove his true value, Scott Hall prepared to make one of the most industry-altering impacts in professional wrestling history. What followed would shake professional wrestling to its core. On May 27, 1996, during an episode of Monday Nitro, Scott Hall emerged unexpectedly from the crowd. Dressed in street clothes rather than wrestling gear, he calmly stepped into the ring, grabbed a microphone, and delivered one of wrestling's most iconic promos. With his distinctive swagger, he warned WCW that he and some friends were coming to take over. 2 weeks later, Kevin Nash joined him, solidifying what fans would come to know as the Outsiders. The brilliance of this angle was its blurring of reality and fiction. Though both men were legitimately no longer employed by WWE, the storyline implied they were invaders sent by the competition. This worked-shoot approach created unprecedented buzz throughout the wrestling world. Were these actual WWE wrestlers invading? Was this real? The ambiguity fueled fan speculation and dramatically boosted ratings. Then came the moment that truly changed wrestling forever. At Bash at the Beach on July 7th, Hall and Nash promised a mystery partner for their 6-man tag match. When Hulk Hogan, wrestling's biggest hero for over a decade, emerged as their ally and turned villain for the first time since becoming a mainstream star, the audience's shock was palpable. As fans pelted the ring with garbage, Hogan proclaimed the formation of the New World Order, declaring war on WCW. The NWO storyline transcended typical wrestling narratives. Its gritty realism, cool factor, and anti-establishment attitude perfectly captured the emerging cultural zeitgeist of the late 1990s. The angle was so convincing that local authorities occasionally received calls reporting real assaults when NWO members attacked wrestlers backstage. People who had never watched wrestling before suddenly couldn't look away. Behind the scenes, Hall's creative fingerprints were all over the NWO concept. His understanding of character psychology, storytelling, and what fans truly wanted to see helped craft what many consider wrestling's most influential angle. The storyline didn't just change WCW, it forced WWE to evolve into the Attitude Era and transformed how wrestling stories would be told for generations to come. But Hall's creative genius extended beyond his own character. The NWO needed a worthy adversary, and it was reportedly Scott Hall who conceived what would become one of wrestling's most iconic transformations. At his suggestion, Sting abandoned his colorful surfer persona and emerged as a silent, brooding vigilante inspired by Brandon Lee's character in The Crow. This reinvention created the perfect counterbalance to the NWO's chaos, a dark avenger lurking in the rafters, waiting to deliver justice. Before that epic confrontation would materialize, the NWO continued expanding its ranks. The faction welcomed Scott's old friend Sean Waltman, now competing as Six, further strengthening the original Outsiders core. With their growing army, Hall and Nash dominated WCW's tag team division, capturing the tag team championships an impressive 6 times. Their battles against legendary teams like Harlem Heat, the technically superior Steiner brothers, and the prestigious Four Horsemen produced some of the era's most memorable matches. But as Hall's professional star reached its zenith, his personal demons grew increasingly difficult to conceal. The substance abuse issues that had followed him throughout his career intensified dramatically without WWE's strict oversight. What began as a controlled habit escalated into a dependency that became painfully apparent even to television viewers. His speech slurred during promos, his movements grew erratic, and his once imposing physique began deteriorating before fans' eyes. By March 1998, the situation had become so dire that WCW was forced to remove him from television entirely, mandating rehabilitation treatment. Despite the company's intervention efforts, Hall's addiction proved too powerful. When he eventually returned to Monday Nitro, the improvements were temporary at best. Fans who had cheered his character's rebellion now watched with genuine concern as the man behind Razor Ramon fought a much more serious battle outside the ring. By 1999, Hall had become nearly invisible on WCW programming, his appearances rare and concerning. In a deeply misguided decision that revealed the company's ethical bankruptcy, they attempted to monetize his struggles by rebranding him as Last Call Scott Hall, complete with an alcoholic gimmick that saw him stumbling to the ring with drink in hand. This exploitation of a man's genuine addiction marked a dark chapter for wrestling storytelling. By February 2000, following a defeat by Sid at Super Brawl 10, Hall vanished from WCW permanently. His subsequent career became a series of brief, troubled appearances. He surfaced briefly in Extreme Championship Wrestling and attempted runs in New Japan, but these stints only highlighted his deteriorating condition. Fans who had once marveled at his in-ring psychology now witnessed a performer clearly struggling to function. Wrestling seemed to offer an unexpected lifeline in 2002. WWE, having purchased WCW's assets the previous year, decided to resurrect the NWO concept with its original members. At February's No Way Out pay-per-view, Hall, Nash, and Hogan returned to WWE programming, interfering in Stone Cold Steve Austin's world title match against Chris Jericho. The resulting program between Hall and Austin held immense potential on paper, two of wrestling's most influential characters finally colliding. In reality, what could have been a dream match years earlier now felt hollow, with Hall clearly battling his personal demons throughout. Their WrestleMania 18 encounter disappointed expectations, remembered primarily for Hall's exaggerated selling of Austin's finishing move rather than for competitive excellence. Behind the spectacular character and innovative mind existed a man fighting battles far more challenging than any wrestling opponent. The contrast between the charismatic performer who revolutionized wrestling and the struggling individual behind the character revealed the profound human cost hidden beneath wrestling's theatrical exterior. After WrestleMania, the NWO storyline crumbled when Hulk Hogan unexpectedly turned babyface and abandoned the group. Desperate to salvage their momentum, Hall and Nash recruited fellow Kliq member Sean Waltman once again, attempting to recapture their faction's former glory. But the angle had lost its spark. By summer, WWE quietly dropped the NWO from television altogether. For Scott Hall, the end came even sooner. On May 7th, his WWE return came to an abrupt halt following the notorious plane ride from hell incident. During the transatlantic flight returning from England, Hall's behavior reportedly spiraled out of control. Alongside several other wrestlers, his actions created such chaos that WWE executives had finally reached their breaking point. The company terminated his contract immediately. Unemployed once again, Hall surveyed a wrestling landscape with increasingly limited options. He eventually landed in the fledgling Total Nonstop Action Wrestling promotion, making sporadic appearances during their 2002 launch period. These brief TNA stints continued through 2004 and 2005, though never developing into consistent programming. The years between major appearances weren't entirely lost time. Behind the scenes, Hall engaged in multiple attempts at rehabilitation. Though lasting sobriety remained elusive, these efforts demonstrated his awareness of his condition and desire to improve. Each attempt to get clean represented a personal battle far more challenging than any in-ring confrontation. On November 1, 2007, a healthier-looking Scott Hall returned to TNA television. Fans witnessed a meaningful reunion as he joined forces with longtime friend Kevin Nash to battle the Angle Alliance. For those who had followed Hall's struggles, seeing him back in action, even temporarily, provided a glimmer of hope that the man behind the wrestler might finally be winning his most important fight. Following that brief return, Hall's reliability issues resurfaced when he no-showed scheduled appearances, severely damaging his relationship with TNA. The promotion kept him off television until January 2010, when he made a surprise comeback to form the band with Nash and Waltman, a thinly veiled recreation of their NWO Kliq glory days. Despite Hulk Hogan's storyline attempts to remove Hall and Waltman from TNA programming, the band continued their disruptive path, launching attacks on various roster members. Their chaos culminated on May 13th, when the reunited Outsiders captured the TNA World Tag Team Championships. However, their reign would be short-lived. By June 14th, TNA stripped them of the titles following Hall's release from the company. Once again, Hall's ongoing substance abuse problems had derailed his career. This time, however, he recognized his desperate need for intervention. In a moment of clarity, he reached out to WWE, taking advantage of their policy that funded rehabilitation for former talent, regardless of their current employment status. This rehabilitation stay revealed a shocking medical complication. After battling a serious case of double pneumonia, doctors diagnosed Hall with epilepsy, a condition likely triggered by years of alcohol abuse. This diagnosis required him to begin a daily regimen of medications to control seizures, adding another layer of complexity to his already challenging health situation. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Hall also required a pacemaker during this period, creating yet another life-threatening health concern. His survival now depended on maintaining sobriety and following strict medical protocols, a challenge that proved overwhelming. Despite his awareness of these dangers, addiction's grip remained powerful. The following years brought multiple relapses, including a frightening April 2011 hospitalization after suffering cardiac issues triggered by an overdose. In 2013, when Hall's prospects seemed bleakest, salvation arrived through an unexpected source: Diamond Dallas Page. By this time, DDP had transformed himself from wrestling star to wellness advocate, having already helped Jake the Snake Roberts achieve sobriety after decades of substance abuse. When Page extended the same lifeline to Hall, offering him residence at his Atlanta home and a chance at rehabilitation, Hall recognized this might be his final opportunity. The transformation that followed was nothing short of remarkable. Within months, the physical and mental improvements were visible to everyone. Through a comprehensive approach combining therapy, detoxification, and DDP's innovative yoga program, Page accomplished what numerous rehabilitation facilities couldn't. He helped Scott Hall reclaim his life. The wrestling community rallied around Hall's recovery efforts. Through crowdfunding, DDP raised nearly $110,000 to cover essential medical procedures Hall desperately needed: hip replacement surgery and extensive dental work. These interventions addressed years of physical neglect and helped restore not just Hall's health but his dignity. The transformation in Scott Hall was nothing short of miraculous. Now sober and healthier than he'd been in decades, he re-emerged into the wrestling world to find an overwhelming outpouring of support from fans and industry colleagues alike. His journey toward redemption reached a powerful milestone in 2014 when WWE announced his induction into their Hall of Fame under the Razor Ramon persona. On April 5, 2014, Hall received his long-overdue recognition in a deeply emotional ceremony. Surrounded by his Click brothers on stage, he delivered one of wrestling's most memorable induction speeches, his signature catchphrase, "Bad times don't last, but bad guys do," taking on profound new meaning. The celebration wasn't just about his in-ring achievements. It marked the triumph of a man who had fought his way back from the edge of destruction. Since that night, with occasional minor setbacks, Hall has maintained his sobriety. The transformation extended beyond physical health, revealing a man at peace with both his legendary contributions to wrestling and his personal journey. His pride shifted to watching his son Cody Hall forge his own path in promotions like New Japan Pro Wrestling and Pro Wrestling Noah. Hall hasn't vanished completely from wrestling. He makes periodic appearances at WWE events, typically alongside his former Click or NWO teammates. These nostalgic moments remind fans of his enduring impact, not just as a consistently excellent performer when healthy, but as one of wrestling's most brilliant creative minds who developed iconic characters and played an instrumental role in crafting the revolutionary NWO storyline that changed professional wrestling forever. Why did Scott Hall never become world champion? This is perhaps wrestling's most fascinating what-if scenario. When Hall debuted as Razor Ramon, WWE immediately positioned him alongside main event talents like Ric Flair and Randy Savage. Throughout his WWE run, he remained at the near pinnacle of the card, delivering classic matches and memorable feuds. His Intercontinental Championship ladder matches with Shawn Michaels revolutionized the industry. The puzzle pieces were all there. Hall possessed the perfect combination of size, in-ring ability, and charisma. His microphone work was exceptional, and fans responded to him whether as heel or face. Yet the World Championship remained elusive. In WWE, timing worked against him. The company was investing heavily in Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Diesel as their champions during Hall's peak years. When Hall approached Vince McMahon about advancing beyond the upper mid-card, McMahon's response revealed the ceiling WWE had placed on him. WCW presented new opportunities, but new obstacles emerged. As a founding NWO member, Hall became one of wrestling's biggest stars during the industry's hottest period. However, the spotlight often centered on Hogan, while Hall's escalating personal struggles made him increasingly unreliable. Jim Ross often said reliability was wrestling's most crucial trait for top champions. Hall's addiction issues, resulting in multiple DUIs and extended absences, made entrusting him with a world championship an enormous risk. Eric Bischoff, despite valuing Hall creatively, couldn't justify putting the company's centerpiece around his waist. The missed storytelling opportunities are heartbreaking to consider. A Hall rebellion against Hogan's leadership could have created compelling television. A championship program with Nash after the Goldberg streak ended might have elevated both men. Instead, Hall remained the extraordinary talent who never quite secured wrestling's ultimate prize. The cruel irony is that among the Click members and original NWO founders, Hall may have been the most complete performer. His combination of size, technical ability, character work, and audience connection was unmatched. What separated him from championship glory wasn't talent, but the personal demons that haunted him throughout his career. In March 2022, wrestling fans around the world were devastated when Scott Hall passed away at the age of 63. His death came after a series of health complications following hip replacement surgery. Hall had been hospitalized after suffering 3 heart attacks on March 12, 2022. These cardiac events occurred when a blood clot was dislodged during his hip surgery. He was placed on life support at Wellstar Kennestone Hospital in Marietta, Georgia, as his condition deteriorated. On March 14, 2022, his longtime friend and fellow wrestling legend Kevin Nash announced on social media that Hall's family had made the difficult decision to discontinue life support once all his loved ones could gather to say goodbye. Hall passed away later that evening. Wrestling's landscape today would be unrecognizable without Hall's contributions. Next up, Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect is the greatest technical wrestler to ever step in the ring. He captured championships in every major territory, mastered moves no one else could execute, and even became wrestling's first true perfectionist who could excel at any sport he touched. But in 2003, one decision would change everything. And it didn't just end Mr. Perfect's career, it tragically ended his life. In 1958, Curt Hennig was born in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. He was the son of Larry the Axe Hennig, one of the most respected wrestlers in the business, soaking up knowledge that would serve him well in the years to come. Wrestling wasn't just something he watched on TV, it was his family's way of life. Growing up, Curt showed early signs that he was something special. In high school, he could do it all. Football teams wanted him, basketball coaches tried to recruit him, and he made everything look easy. But despite all these offers coming his way, Curt knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. Just like his father before him, the wrestling ring was calling his name. When Curt started training with wrestling legend Verne Gagne, something became clear right away. Curt was a natural in the ring. While most new wrestlers needed months of practice, Curt picked everything up instantly, like he'd been doing it his whole life. Starting out in the AWA in 1980, Curt felt a lot of pressure on his shoulders. Everyone kept comparing him to his dad, Larry the Axe Hennig, one of the toughest wrestlers around. For a young guy just starting out, those were some big boots to fill. That's why in 1981, Curt jumped at the chance to work for Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation. The run didn't last long though, as his wife was about to have their first baby. But in that short time, he caught McMahon's eye as someone special. Going back to the AWA turned out to be a smart move. Curt teamed up with a young Scott Hall, and together, they won the tag team titles. They would end up being one of the last great teams in AWA history. But it was when Curt started wrestling on his own that things really took off. In 1987, he hit the biggest moment of his career so far, beating the legendary Nick Bockwinkel to become AWA World Champion. This was huge not just for Curt, but for the whole Hennig family, as even his dad Curt had finally stepped out of his father's shadow. He held that title for over a year, but by the late 1980s, the AWA was in trouble. The company that had been around for decades was starting to fall apart. Lucky for Curt, though, Vince McMahon hadn't forgotten about the talented young wrestler he'd seen years before. As the AWA was heading toward its end, McMahon came calling with an offer that would change everything. When Curt walked back into the WWF in 1988, Vince McMahon could hardly believe how much he'd grown. The young kid who'd briefly worked for him years before had turned into a complete performer. Everyone needed a character, something that would make them stand out from the crowd. That's how Mr. Perfect was born. Looking at Curt's background as a natural athlete who'd excelled at every sport he tried, McMahon knew they had something special on their hands. Yes, they filmed those now famous TV spots showing Mr. Perfect doing amazing things in different sports. Sinking impossible basketball shots, throwing perfect spirals in football, and even bowling perfect games. While some of these needed a few takes to get right, Curt's natural ability meant he could actually do most of these feats himself. Even when he wasn't the one doing the talking, Curt found ways to steal the show. While Flair was cutting one of his famous promos, fans couldn't help but watch Perfect in the background, making faces and reactions that made everything even better. During their time working together, Curt and Rick became close friends. which wasn't surprising given Curt's personality. Behind the scenes, Curt was known as one of the most well-liked guys in the locker room. He was always ready with a joke or a prank to lighten the mood, the kind of person who could make everyone laugh even on their worst days. But while he kept everyone else smiling, Curt was fighting his own battles. His back wasn't getting any better, and he'd started relying more and more on painkillers just to get through the day. Yes, even though he wasn't taking bumps in the ring anymore, the pain from his injuries just wouldn't go away. The 1992 Survivor Series was set to feature a huge tag team match, The Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage against Ric Flair and Razor Ramon. But when Warrior suddenly quit the company right before the show, Vince McMahon found himself in a tight spot. After running through his options, each time ever he'd be playing a good guy. But just like everything else in his career, Curt made it look easy. Fans who'd spent years hating him now found themselves cheering as he sent his old friend Ric Flair packing back to WCW in a loser leaves town match in January '93. After that, he had good feuds with rising stars like Shawn Michaels and Lex Luger. But something was different this time around. The sad truth was that Curt just couldn't move like he used to, and both he and the fans could see it. By 1996, Vince McMahon was trying to get Mr. Perfect back in the ring one more time. The timing seemed odd, though. Curt was about to get a $300,000 payout from his insurance deal, money he planned to use for retirement. Then, out of nowhere, Lloyd's of London refused to pay up. Curt had his suspicions about this, thinking Vince might have pulled some strings to force him back to work. Yes, while no one ever proved if this was true or not, the whole thing left a bad taste in Curt's mouth. Angry about the situation, Curt reached out to Eric Bischoff over at WCW, coming to an abrupt end after what became known as the plane ride from hell. Yes, on a commercial flight back from the UK to the US, several wrestlers got out of hand, but Curt's actions stood out even among the chaos. After having too much to drink, he got into a wrestling match with Brock Lesnar that ended up with both men crashing into the plane's emergency exit, the kind of thing that could have ended in tragedy. When the dust settled from that infamous flight, several wrestlers lost their jobs, and Curt was among them. For the next few months, Curt bounced around the independent wrestling scene. Showing up at CERN in 2002, Curt Hennig's story would come to a tragic end on February 10, 2003. He was supposed to wrestle at the Florida State Fair that day, part of his ongoing effort to climb back to the top of the business he loved. But at 10 p.m. in a moment that would shake the wrestling world, a hotel housekeeper made a devastating discovery: Curt's body in his room. At just 44 years old, leaving behind a wife and 4 children who would now have to go on without their perfect dad.
I lost somebody that meant the world to me. He wasn't only my dad, he was like a brother. He was my hero.
When the Hillsborough County Medical Examiner's Office released their findings on March 26, 2003, the official cause was listed as acute cocaine intoxication. But like so many wrestling deaths of that era, the full story wasn't quite that simple. For Curt's father, Larry "the Axe" Hennig, things just didn't add up. Speaking in the book The Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, The Heels, Larry voiced the questions that haunted him. "It's not quite clear to me yet, and perhaps it never will be," he said. "From my standpoint, it just looked like it was one of those one-night deals. Got in with the wrong people." Unlike many veterans who kept their knowledge to themselves, Curt believed in passing on what he'd learned. Yes, following the example set by Roddy Piper before him, he took countless younger wrestlers under his wing, including future star Brock Lesnar. As Sean Waltman would later recall, Curt saw teaching others as his duty to the business. But maybe what people remember most about Curt was his ability to light up any room he walked into. Stone cold. Steve Austin recalled never seeing Curt in a bad mood, while others talked about how he could turn around the atmosphere in even the most miserable locker room. Today, his legacy lives on through his son Curtis Axel, who carries the Hennig name proudly in the ring. Before every match, Curtis quietly prays to his father. While his story may have ended too soon, his legacy lives on through the countless matches he left behind, the performers he influenced, and the memories he created for fans around the world.